Thank you, Julian, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to the organisers for the invitation to present. So, okay, the clicker unfortunately doesn't work, so you'll have to put up with me shouting next. I'm afraid quite a lot during this talk. So the title for this talk then is Getting It Right from the Start, the importance of ESG in exploration. And before I start, I should acknowledge the major contributions of my colleagues within SRK Consulting, the ESG team there, particularly Jane and my colleague Ben Lepley as well, who provided a lot of the content and inspiration for this talk. And it's only down to them, thankfully, that I'm able to be here today. Okay, next then, please. So why is ESG then important at the start then? I mean, quite a basic sort of question, really. I think really, next, please. Essentially, I think we would all agree that there's been a paradigm shift really in the attitudes of mining companies and the wider community of the role of ESG in mining and exploration. Next, please. And I think it's also safe to say that mining hasn't traditionally been one of the most sort of attractive professions to the wider community, to non-technicals, non-professionals. There's an inherent misunderstanding of where materials actually come from, of course. And recent articles in the press, as you see on the screen here, have only unfortunately served to demonstrate that there are still a lot of issues involved in the mining process that need to be addressed, unfortunately. They don't make good reading for anyone, for those professionals involved in mining and exploration, and they certainly need to be addressed. Next slide, please. So I think this used to be the image of mining in the past, of some great machine guzzling resources around the world and spitting out pollution and stuff that people don't need. And perhaps to a certain extent there's still a degree of this, but I think that the attitudes towards this, the social acceptability of mining, is now changing, and that stakeholders in particular of those companies that are listed are no longer willing to accept that practices perhaps that were acceptable perhaps in the past. Next slide. And this is, I think this can be, you can only have to look at recent surveys. This is some results from a recent EY survey of the attitudes of the top mining companies in the world in terms of what do they actually perceive as the biggest issues coming into the next year and beyond from investors. And you can see that a lot of these issues are ESG related. They are no longer issues regarding the processing or processability of an ore, for example. They are dominantly ESG related issues. So local community impact, for example, water management, be it too much or too little, green protection, diversity, to name just but a few. Next, please. So embedding ESG then, so it's I think hopefully clear to a lot of, certainly from a lot of mining companies' perspectives, that the importance of ESG is massively raised in profile than it ever used to be. And embedding that ESG at an early stage is fundamental to the success and longevity of the industry. Next slide. So next, please. So this used to be the, next, please. I think in the 1990s, this was commonly the attitude of ESG and its role in mining projects. It's kind of like engineers designing something and then saying to the environmentalists, well, this is our plan, go out and get this permitted. As long as we get the permits, that's what we want, that's what we're looking for. Next, please. This evolved in the 2000s, perhaps to engineers turning to environmentalists and saying, well, you give us the criteria and we'll design the product for you, if you like, or the project to conform to those specifications. But I think we're moving on again from that now. Next. And I hope now that going forward, from now going forward really, that we'll have a more of a collaborative attitude between engineers and environmentalists. So instead of the engineers saying, this is what we want you to do, go out and do it, it's more of a, please join with us to make this project more socially and environmentally acceptable. right at the start, rather than as an afterthought, if you like. Next, please. Now, the importance of embedding ESG early is that effectively the early bird does indeed catch the worm in terms of avoiding and mitigating the effects of any impacts of exploration and ultimately mining. And there are far more opportunities to avoid and mitigate ESG and impacts upfront earlier on in the stage than there is once the mine actually starts to operate. So right at the start, you're really looking for, the focus should really be on impact avoiding. It's far easier to avoid the need to mitigate any impacts if you actually avoid the need for those impacts to occur in the first place. And if you look at the time, look at the chart on the top of the screen there, that's the mining life cycle from exploration all the way through to development and ultimately closure. You can see that there's a lot of places along that timeline where there is a greater potential to avoid and potentially mitigate issues relating to mining right at the start of the process, rather than once the mine actually starts and gets up and running. And I think really it's important to identify those material risks to the project. In other words, the harm to the reputation or the financial risk to that company, but also identifying the salient issues with the project itself, and that, in other words, the harm to people, flora and fauna, for example, in the environment. And the ultimate aim, of course, is to reduce the effects of and mitigate those effects where they can't be avoided, and ultimately compensate for any impacts that you're trying to or that are an unavoidable part of the mining process. Next slide, please. Okay, next. So early site visits are critical in terms of understanding baseline conditions to a project. For an exploration project on a greenfield site, for example, issues of water management, next, please, are important to be understood together with biodiversity and the existing state of the ecosystem, for example. I appreciate that the slide may not necessarily be legible to those at the back, but the slides will be available online after the conference. Next, please. As well as, importantly, interacting and engaging with the local communities in the area, if indeed there are any local communities available or around, not available. Next, please. And of course, it's really important to understand that, if you're looking at a deposit, there may actually already be people working there already. Artisanal or small scale miners may actually already be there at the moment, and their livelihoods may depend upon the mineral resource that ultimately you're trying to explore and exploit. So engaging with the whole community is really, really important right at the start with an early site visit observations. Next, please. So a few examples. I mean, I would say that the tide is turning a little bit. There are companies out there who are now implementing better and earlier, more importantly, earlier methods into the exploration process to better mitigate or avoid any effects of exploration at an early stage. And some of these have been taken from PDAC's excellent E3 environmental excellence case studies, which you can find on the PDAC's website. But some of these from the top left, for example, using low impact exploration techniques like, for example, hand portable drilling equipment, rather than the need to put in a haul road and bring in a massive great drill rig at an early stage. Perhaps revegetating former areas where historical mining has led to a degradation of the soil and the environment. In the Arctic, you might have, for example, the importance of sound barriers to mitigate the effects of the drilling to any local environment or people around. And an example from the UK in the bottom right hand screen, which is, again, I appreciate it's not particularly easy to see from the stands up there, but in a way that's actually quite useful because, believe it or not, there is a drill rig in the center of that picture. It's surrounded by hay bales in this particular example, both to mitigate effect the effect of visually on the drill rig being there, but also from the sound point of view, so that the local community isn't doesn't have lots of sound from the drilling operation. So again, this is another example of things that you can implement at a relatively early stage to ensure that the exploration process is undertaken in the best way possible. Next, please. So in summary for this part of the talk then, I think ESG is critical from the exploration phase onwards, and it can add significant value to a project. It's really important to everybody that first impressions do last. So if you are the first company going into a greenfield area to do exploration, and there are people there, their first impression of you will really fundamentally depend ultimately on whether the mining project proceeds or not, subsequent obviously to all of the various environmental and permitting issues that have to be gone through. And that's assuming, of course, you even find something there in the first place. But ultimately designing a sensible ESG strategy requires cross-discipline collaboration between lots of different specialists. You need to look at low impact engineering, and impact avoidance is better than impact mitigation. There's more opportunity to avoid or mitigate effects earlier on in the process rather than doing it subsequent. And you need to look at things like health, safety, environmental and community risk assessments, and all the time thinking about human rights. I mean, if I was actually on the ground at the time, what would I want? If somebody came and explored in the area that I was living in their situation, what would I want? I'd want interaction. I'd want to know what was going on. Next. Okay, stakeholder engagement then, and another critical part of the early stage of ESG. This is a photo, believe it or not, 15 years ago from Afghanistan, when I was engaged in a project funded at that stage by the British government, talking to some of the tribal elders in this particular area. This is on a platinum exploration project. Next slide, please. So I know I won't go through all of these, and I know that they may not necessarily be legible from the top, but suffice to say, there are a huge amount of different stakeholders that you need to consult. Okay, it's not just a case of the people who live on the ground, and it's not just a case of dealing with the government itself. There are a massive amount of stakeholders or potential stakeholders that have an interest in the project that you're working for, and it's important that you understand who these are, and you can interact with them to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the circumstances, as best as possible. Next, please. Okay, this is just a very generic example of how it can work. So next, so if you want, for example, to have mine, assuming that you found some kind of minerals in the first place, all right? Next, please. So if you found something, but there are some environmental issues associated with that project or in that area, but you don't have community interaction, you don't talk about what you're planning on doing, you don't try and mitigate any of the effects, you're probably not going to develop that into a mine, no matter how good it is. But if you want to have a mine, of course, there's still environmental issues, but you do have this community interaction, you might have to go back and refine your plans. And of course, you then go back and you discuss this with the stakeholders again, and you might have to go back several times and do several iterations of what you're planning on doing. But the advantage of that is that ultimately, providing all the economic factors, etc., are taken into consideration, that gives you a greater percentage chance of being able to develop a mine if you've done it at all, if you've not actually involved the local community or stakeholders. Next, please. So in summary for this bit then, I think diverse opinions, they drive innovation, okay? And you've got to look at risk management. Again, first impressions do matter to the local stakeholders. There's a requirement of standards to be implemented, of course, and you need to build a trust with the local stakeholders. And all the time, consider that ultimately you will be designing for closure of that operation should it ever run. Next, please. So notwithstanding the fact that morally it's probably an obligation for companies to do the right thing by thinking about all of these ESG issues as well, we also the final point in this talk is the fact that it's actually beneficial to the company themselves in terms of been able to secure financing. And we've already touched on some of that earlier on in the panel session this morning. So current resources and reserves reporting requirements. So next, please. So these are all of the different resource panels, if you like, around the world, all the different CRISCO members. Some of them may be more familiar to you than others. For example, JORC and the Canadian Instruments 43101. But fundamentally, they all have an element of ESG within them currently. But the important thing is that this is actually going to change, and there's going to be a huge amount more of importance placed on the role of ESG in the future. Next slide, please. So at the moment, the whole reporting and reserves standard, the way that you do it, it relies on transparency, materiality, and competence of the actual report that you are submitting. These are the overriding principles, and ESG has always been, as I say, an important and integral part of those reporting requirements. However, there are new standards being brought in and new sections to some of the reporting codes. For example, section 5.5 of the CRISCO, some of the CRISCO codes says that ESG issues are now, resources and reserves need to be treated the same as each other. And chapter 12 and 13 provides clarity on the permitting process as part of the reporting codes, and you can read about these in your own time. But the importance of this particular slide is to emphasize that it's no longer an optional extra to talk about ESG as a sort of an add-on. The sooner you integrate it, the better, really, and it can fundamentally impact the whole viability of your mining operation and your ability to raise funds. The competent person does need to know now a little bit about ESG issues in order to sign it off. Next, please. So in summary, and I'm coming up to the end of this presentation. So, it's all about improving transparency, ultimately to everything that is reported from exploration companies. ESG, as I say, has been part of resources and reserves reporting for some time, but recent updates have got a much more ESG focus on them. And as I say, the CP or QP does need to have some ESG knowledge in order to be able to sign them off as prospects, for ultimate economic extraction. And early ESG input will only lower that risk in terms of the risk of the project actually not going ahead. Next, please. So the key takeaways then, finally. Next, please. Now, again, I'll leave you to read about this by having a look at the slides online in your own time. But fundamentally, the do's and the don'ts are basically get involved with a conversation about ESG at the earliest possible opportunity. Know the jurisdiction that you're working in. They're not all the same. Individual areas have their own requirements. It's important to understand and identify the potential risks and impacts at an early stage to mitigate or avoid them. And avoidance is always better than mitigating against them. And embedding good ESG protocols into your operation at an early stage is fundamental to the success of any projects. What you don't do is you overpromise. You don't engage with the, you don't, of course you need to engage with them at all, but some people, you don't not engage with them. It's double negative, but yeah, engaging with them is the right way forward. You don't assume that major potential or major risks or potential impacts will be dealt with at a later stage, and they're not material at an exploration stage. And you don't omit vulnerable groups or key stakeholders in your operations. These are really, they're not particularly, they're fairly obvious statements to make, but it's a lot of companies that choose to either ignore or omit them from their initial operations. Anyway, so that's more or less it now. So next slide, please. Yeah, so thank you very much. That gives you a very brief overview of the role of ESG in exploration and why it's fundamentally important to do it at an early stage. And I would encourage any operators involved in projects to engage with communities and with consultants like ourselves. Of course, I would say that at an early stage, just to make sure that the project has got the best opportunity of success. Thank you very much for your attention.